In April of 2021, police officers in a small town in Colorado entered a house after receiving a strange report. Inside, they found a body. It had been wrapped in a sleeping bag. The corpse had been decorated with Christmas lights. Glitter covered her face, and the body had been arranged almost like a shrine. But the people living in the house insisted nothing was wrong. The woman in the sleeping bag, they said, wasn't dead. She was ascending. Her name was Amy Carlson, and to her followers, she wasn't just a spiritual teacher, she was Mother God. Carlson claimed she had lived for billions of years and had previously incarnated as figures like Jesus, Cleopatra, and Joan of Arc. Her mission, she said, was to guide humanity into a higher dimension. And what makes this story so strange isn't just the belief system, it's that almost all of it happened in public. Carlson and her followers live streamed their lives online for years. You could still watch the videos today, hours and hours of footage where followers praise Mother God, argue with skeptics in the chat, and defend her teachings even as her health visibly deteriorates on camera. In older cult stories, historians usually reconstruct what happened afterward through interviews and court records and survivor testimony. But in this case, the group documented itself in real time, which means we have something historians rarely get: a front row seat to how a modern cult actually operates. Today, we're looking at what happens when cult psychology meets the infrastructure of the internet, because some of the most fascinating cult movements of the last decade didn't grow in isolation. They grew online. If you wanted to, right now, you could go watch hours of footage from one of these groups: live streams, coaching sessions, entire belief systems unfolding on camera. We'll walk through the online relationship movement called Twin Flames Universe, where followers paid thousands of dollars in coaching programs while leaders claimed the authority to identify their destined partners and even pressure members to change their identities in pursuit of a spiritual union. We'll walk through a live streamed spiritual community known as Love Has Won, where followers broadcast their lives around a woman who claimed she was guiding humanity through a cosmic transformation. This technology is new, but the psychology behind these movements will probably sound very familiar. So let's rewind and let's get into it. If you listen to part one of this series, you probably noticed that many of the 20th century cults shared a similar structure. There was usually a charismatic leader claiming special insight into the world. A close community formed around that leader, and over time, that community tended to pull further and further away from outside influences. Often the separation was physical. Groups gathered in compounds or communal homes where members lived together and worked together and spent most of their time with their other believers. For movements like the People's Temple or Heaven's Gate, the environment itself became part of the belief system. The groups shared the same routines, the same language, the same sources of information. Those settings helped reinforce devotion. They also meant that building a cult required a surprising amount of infrastructure. Leaders had to recruit people face to face. They had to persuade followers to relocate, to cut ties with old communities, and to gradually accept the group's version of reality. For decades, that basic structure shaped how cults operated. When the internet began changing how communities formed, everything changed. People who might never have met in the physical world could suddenly gather in the same digital space. Forums, live streams, and social platforms allowed leaders to reach audiences far beyond their immediate surroundings. Belief communities no longer needed a single shared location. They could develop across cities, countries, and time zones. And in some ways, the structure looked familiar. There was a central figure, a shared language, and a group identity forming around common ideas. What had changed was the environment in which those relationships developed. And once belief communities started forming online, the dynamics that had once unfolded inside compounds began appearing in places that looked far more ordinary. Which brings us to the first modern example. Because if you want to see how cult dynamics can grow inside a digital community, there's a case that illustrates it in remarkable detail. It began with the promise that many people are already searching for online: the idea that somewhere in the world, there's one person who is destined to be yours. The idea begins with something that sounds almost comforting. Somewhere in the world, there is one person meant for you. Not just someone compatible, Not just someone you might fall in love with, a single person whose soul is permanently connected to yours. A relationship that is not accidental, not circumstantial, but written into the structure of the universe itself. In spiritual circles, that person is called your twin flame. The idea is not new. Variations of it have floated through New Age spirituality for decades. The concept draws loosely from older philosophical ideas about split souls and destined partners, but in the 2010s, the internet did what the internet always does to spiritual ideas. It turned them into content. That's where Jeff and Shalea Ian enter the story. They began posting videos online, and the tone of their content was surprisingly ordinary. Their YouTube channel didn't look like the beginning of a cult movement. It looked like a relationship advice channel with a spiritual twist. The videos were calm. Soft lighting, gentle music, Jeff and Shalea speaking directly to the camera about heartbreak and self-worth and emotional healing. The kind of content that feels familiar if you've ever fallen down the rabbit hole of self-help videos late at night after a breakup. And that timing matters because the people most likely to find content like this aren't casual viewers. They're people in pain, people whose relationships have just collapsed, people trying to understand why someone they love suddenly disappeared from their lives. When someone in that state hears an explanation that gives meaning to the chaos, it can feel incredibly powerful. Jeff and Shalea offered exactly that kind of explanation. If a relationship ended suddenly, it didn't mean it was meaningless. It meant the connection was deeper than you realized. If someone pulled away, it didn't mean the relationship was over. It meant they were overwhelmed by the intensity of the bond. The framework transformed rejection into something entirely different. It wasn't failure, it was part of a journey. Viewers who stumbled onto these videos began leaving comments describing experiences that felt strangely similar, someone they couldn't stop thinking about, a relationship that felt inexplicably intense, a connection that ended abruptly but never quite felt finished. Soon, those viewers began finding each other. Facebook groups started forming where people shared stories about their supposed twin flames, conversations filled with phrases like spiritual mirroring and divine timing and emotional blocks. Members compared timelines of relationships, wondering whether someone from the past might actually be the person the videos described. And like many online communities, it began to develop its own language. Members spoke about, quote, union, the moment when twin flames finally come together. They talked about runners and chasers, which were roles assigned to partners when one person pulls away from the connection while the other continues pursuing it. Inside the community, these ideas began to organize people's personal lives. Someone whose partner had suddenly stopped responding to messages might be reassured that they were simply the runner in the relationship. The silence wasn't rejection, it was fear. Fear of the spiritual intensity of the connection. And that explanation could be incredibly seductive because heartbreak is confusing and it leaves people with questions that rarely have satisfying answers. Like, why did this happen? Why did someone who seemed so close suddenly disappear? Why does the connection still feel unfinished? Twin Flames Universe offered answers to all of those questions. The problem wasn't that the relationship had failed, they'd say. The problem was that the two souls involved had not yet grown enough to handle the connection. And if that growth could happen, reunion was inevitable. That certainty became the foundation of the movement. People didn't just watch the videos, they started asking the people who made them for help. And as the audience grew, the videos slowly began to change. At first, Jeff and Shalea were simply offering interpretations of the twin flame idea, but over time they began presenting something more structured. There was a method and a framework, and they said that it could help people move closer to union with their twin flame. They called it the mirror exercise. On the surface, the idea sounded almost therapeutic. The premise was that every painful interaction in a relationship reflects something unresolved within you. If something hurts you, if someone hurts you, the pain isn't really about the other person. It's a mirror revealing an emotional wound that still needs healing. That concept isn't entirely foreign to modern psychology. Therapists sometimes encourage people to examine their emotional reactions and ask what deeper fears or patterns might be involved. But inside the twin flame system, the mirror exercise took on a very different role. It wasn't simply a tool for reflection. It became the central logic that explained every problem a member might encounter. If a partner stopped returning calls, the interpretation wasn't that the relationship might be over, it meant something inside you still needed healing. If someone blocked you or ended the relationship, that didn't mean the connection had failed. It meant the other person was reacting to emotional wounds they had not yet faced. And the solution was always the same: more inner work, more commitment to the process. Followers were encouraged to sit down with the mirror exercise whenever conflict appeared in their lives. The practice involved writing out the situation that caused the pain, identifying the emotion it triggered, and then tracing that feeling back to an unresolved belief about themselves. If you felt rejected, perhaps you secretly believed you were unworthy of love. If you felt abandoned, perhaps you feared being alone. The exercise would guide you through rewriting that belief so that it aligned with the idea that you were already whole and deserving. Within the system, the mirror exercise became both explanation and solution. And if your twin flame rejected you, it meant you needed the exercise. If you felt doubt about the relationship, you needed the exercise. And if the relationship seemed impossible, that only meant the emotional wounds being mirrored were deeper than you realized. Former members later described how powerful this framework could be when they first encountered it. In interviews featured in the documentary Escaping Twin Flames, several followers said the exercise initially felt like genuine self growth. It encouraged introspection. It gave people language to process complicated emotions, but the structure of the belief, the structure of the whole system, created a subtle shift. Over time, every problem in a relationship began pointing back to the same conclusion. If something was going wrong, the issue could never be the doctrine itself. The issue was always about the person experiencing the problem. Essentially, inside the twin flames philosophy, both roles between the runner and the chaser were considered temporary. So eventually, the runner would stop running and the chaser would stop chasing. Eventually, they would reunite. That certainty became the gravitational center of the entire belief system. And once that whole structure was in place, the role of Jeff and Shalea inside the community began to grow. Members weren't just asking them for advice anymore, they were asking them for answers. Answers about their relationships, answers about their emotional blocks, and eventually answers about something much bigger. They wanted to know one thing in particular, which was, who is their actual twin flame? Once members accepted the idea that their twin flame relationship was destined, a new question naturally followed. If every person has exactly one twin flame, how do you know who that person is? At first, followers tried to figure it out on their own. They compared stories inside Facebook groups and described past relationships that felt unusually intense or emotionally complicated. Sometimes people convinced themselves that an ex from years earlier must have been their twin flame all along, but eventually, many members began turning to Jeff and Shalea for something more definitive. They asked the leaders to just tell them, and slowly, Jeff and Shalea began doing exactly that. In coaching calls and online sessions, the leaders would sometimes announce that they had identified two members as twin flames. The declarations often happened in group settings with dozens of followers watching the moment unfold. Former members later described the experience as surreal. One participant featured in the documentary Escaping Twin Flames recalled hearing the name of her supposed twin flame during a live stream call. Until that moment, she had barely spoken to that person. But when the leaders made the announcement, the reaction from the group was immediate. The chat filled with congratulations, and other members celebrated the moment as if something sacred had just been revealed. Inside the community, the leader's authority carried enormous weight. If Jeff and Shalea said two people were twin flames, that declaration was treated as not as a suggestion, but as truth. And once a pairing was announced, the expectation was clear. The relationship should move toward union. And for some members, that meant reaching out to somebody they barely knew. For others, it meant re entering relationships they had already ended. Former followers later described feeling pressure to pursue connections that felt uncomfortable or confusing, but questioning the pairing carried its own risks because if Jeff and Shalea had identified your twin flame, rejecting that identification could be interpreted as your resistance to your own spiritual path. In other words, the leaders weren't simply offering advice about relationships anymore, they were defining them. And that authority extended beyond pairing people together. In several cases described by former members, followers who were already in committed relationships were told that their current partner was not their true twin flame. Instead, they were instructed to pursue someone else inside the community. These decisions could be seen as devastating. Long term relationships were ending, engagements were called off. Lives that had been built around one partner suddenly shifted toward another person that leaders had declared they were spiritually destined for. At this point, outside observers often struggled to understand how someone could reorganize their life around a claim made during an online coaching call. But inside the belief system, the logic felt compelling. If twin flames were real, and if Jeff and Shalea had the spiritual insight to identify them, then following their guidance meant aligning yourself with the truth of your own destiny. For members already deeply invested in the philosophy, the choice didn't feel like obedience, it felt like commitment. Over time, the leaders involved in members' lives grew even more personal. Followers began bringing increasingly intimate questions to coaching sessions. They asked about their careers, their emotional struggles, their sense of purpose. And many described Jeff and Shalea as the only people who truly understood the spiritual journey they were on. But the most controversial development came when the doctrine expanded to address a problem the original philosophy hadn't anticipated. What happens when two people who believe they are twin flames are the same sex? Inside the twin flames framework, every relationship was supposed to represent a balance between what the group called divine masculine energy and divine feminine energy. So when same sex pairings appeared inside the community, the leaders offered a new interpretation. If two women believed they were twin flames, Jeff and Shalea sometimes suggested that one of them might actually be spiritually misaligned with her gender. The same explanation appeared when two men believed they shared a twin flame connection. In those situations, the solution offered by the leaders could be startling. One partner, they said, might need to transition their gender in order to bring the relationship into proper energetic alignment. Former members interviewed in the documentary described feeling intense pressure to accept these interpretations. The leaders framed the transition not as a personal choice, but as a spiritual realization about the members' true identity. For people already deeply embedded in the belief system, the suggestion carried enormous weight. Jeff and Shalea had positioned themselves as the only people capable of interpreting the twin flame journey correctly. If they said something about your identity or your relationship was spiritually misaligned, challenging that interpretation could feel like rejecting the entire path you had committed yourself to. At the same time, the financial structure of the organization continued expanding. Courses, coaching sessions, and membership programs multiplied. Some classes cost hundreds of dollars, others cost thousands. Members who wanted deeper access to the teachings could enroll in increasingly expensive programs promising accelerated spiritual growth. So, how did this story end? Unlike many of the cult movements we studied in part one, Twin Flames Universe did not end like with a raid or a trial or a sudden collapse. The documentaries brought intense scrutiny for sure, and former members spoke publicly about their experiences, and state authorities did open investigation into the organization's business practices, but the movement itself never disappeared. The courses are still online. The teachers are still teaching, and the community still exists in the same place where it all began, on the internet. Let's move into the next cult, Love Has Won. The story we opened with, the house in Colorado with the sleeping bag and the Christmas lights, did not appear out of nowhere. For the people involved, it was the final chapter of a belief system that had been developing for years. The group itself was called Love Has Won. At the center of it was a woman named Amy Carlson. Carlson had lived what most people would describe as an ordinary life. She grew up in Kansas, raised children, and worked a series of everyday jobs. For a time, she managed a McDonald's restaurant. From the outside, nothing about her life suggested that she would eventually become the spiritual leader of an internet-based cult. Then, in her mid-30s, she began telling friends and family that she had undergone a profound awakening. Carlson said she had discovered who she truly was. She was not simply a spiritual teacher or healer, she was Mother God. According to Carlson's teachings, she had existed for billions of years and had lived countless lives throughout human history. In different live streams, she claimed to have previously incarnated as figures including Jesus, Cleopatra, Joan of Arc, Marilyn Monroe, and even the Statue of Liberty. Each of those lives, she said, had been part of a long cosmic mission. Her purpose in this lifetime was to guide humanity through a coming planetary transformation and help raise the collective consciousness of the world. Ideas like this were not entirely new. Spiritual movements blending New Age beliefs, reincarnation, and apocalyptic transformation had been circulating for decades. What made Carlson's movement unusual was the way it spread. Instead of building a secluded community or holding in-person seminars, Carlson and her followers turned to live streaming. Members of the group began broadcasting their daily lives online for hours at a time. Sometimes they sat around kitchen tables just discussing spiritual ideas. Other times they answered questions from viewers or explained the cosmic mission they believed they were carrying out. Anyone could watch. Anyone could comment in the chat. And over time, a small but intensely devoted audience began to form. Followers referred to Carlson as Mother God or Mama God. The group described itself as humanity's spiritual support team, working behind the scenes to help Earth ascend into a higher dimension. Members took on titles that reflected the mythology they were building together. At various times, different men in the group served as Father God, Carlson's spiritual partner and counterpart in the divine hierarchy. Those roles shifted frequently, as you can imagine, and the relationships inside the community often changed. The live streams created a constant window into the group's internal world. Viewers watched members discuss cosmic battles between light and dark forces. They described humanity as trapped inside a corrupted system that Mother God was working to dismantle. The broadcasts also served another purpose. They were the center of the group's economy. Through their website and live streams, the group sold spiritual products and services. These included crystal packages, healing sessions, and something they called etheric surgery, which they described as a form of remote spiritual healing. Customers could pay hundreds of dollars for sessions where members claimed to remove energetic blockages or repair spiritual damage in the body. For the followers living inside the community, the live streams structured daily life. Members spent long hours broadcasting and moderating chat sessions and interacting with viewers who believed in Mother God's mission. The internet allowed the group to function almost like a continuous performance. Instead of occasional gatherings or sermons, the belief system unfolded hour by hour on camera. And that visibility created something historians of cult movements rarely have access to. This was a detailed record of how belief systems reinforce themselves in real time. Viewers watching the live streams could observe how members spoke about Mother God, how they interpreted events, and how they responded when outsiders questioned the group. Inside the broadcasts, Carlson's authority appeared unquestioned. Followers thanked her constantly for saving the planet. They described her as the only capable being of guiding humanity into the next stage of evolution. When critics appeared in the chat, members responded quickly, defending Carlson's teachings and dismissing outsiders as people who had not yet awakened. Over time, Carlson's behavior during the live streams became increasingly erratic. She drank heavily during broadcasts. Her speech often was slurred, and at times she appeared agitated or disoriented while speaking to followers. Her physical condition also began to change. Carlson lost significant weight, and her skin gradually developed a grayish blue tint, which doctors later suggested may have been caused by excessive consumption of colloidal silver, a substance sometimes promoted in alternative medicine communities. You can literally see them feeding this to her constantly around the clock in one of the more recent documentaries. To outside viewers, the decline looked really alarming, but inside the belief system, it meant something very different. Followers explained that Mother God was absorbing negative energy from humanity in order to heal the planet. Her physical suffering demonstrated the scale of her sacrifice. This kind of interpretation is not unusual in high control belief systems. Researchers who study cult dynamics often describe a process where events are filtered through the group's existing worldview. Rather than challenging the belief system, contradictory evidence is reinterpreted as proof that the system is working. Inside the Love Has Won community, the live stream format intensified that process. Members spent most of their time together online or in the same small group of houses, so they spoke the same language, repeated the same explanations, and reinforced the same interpretations of events. The constant digital connection created an environment where alternative perspectives rarely entered the conversation. Over time, the group moved through a series of homes across the American West, living together while continuing to run their broadcasts and online store. And Carlson's health continued to deteriorate right on camera. By early 2021, the changes were impossible to ignore. In some live streams, she appeared barely able to even sit upright. Her voice grew weaker. At times, other members of the group spoke for her while explaining that Mother God's body was undergoing an extraordinary transformation. Followers described the process as the final stage of her ascension. In April of that year, Carlson died. Inside the community, the event did not immediately register as death. Members believed Mother God had begun her final transition into a higher realm. They wrapped her body in a sleeping bag and decorated it with Christmas lights, placing it inside the house as part of a shrine. For several days, the group continued operating under the belief that Mother God was completing her ascension. Eventually, someone contacted authorities. When police entered the house, they discovered the scene that would later appear in headlines across the country. For many readers encountering the story in the news, the details seemed almost impossible to comprehend. But for historians studying cult movements, the underlying structure looks surprisingly familiar. There was a central leader here claiming divine authority. There was a community interpreting every event through that leader's spiritual significance. And there was a shared worldview reinforced through constant interaction. The beliefs echo patterns that have appeared in religious movements for centuries. What's different is the setting. Instead of a secluded compound, the community existed inside live streams, in chat rooms, and social media feeds. The group didn't hide from the outside world, but in many ways, it performed its belief system in front of it. And as a personal aside, I just actually watched the documentary on this, and I think it was HBO Max. And when I tell you, you can literally watch all of this unfolding in real time. You really can, down to her very last breath. It is probably one of the most compelling documentaries I've ever seen, simply because of how entranced and completely loyal her followers were and are still. It was just eye-opening and mind-blowing. I can't even begin to explain. You have to go watch it. So, here's the big question I keep trying to develop a point of view on. Did the internet create more susceptibility to cults, or did it simply remove the barriers that once kept susceptible people from finding each other? Or both? Earlier movements often grew slowly, and it was limited by travel and geography and the practical challenges of organizing people in one place. Online communities can expand much faster, connecting strangers across cities, countries, and continents in real time. And that raises more questions. Are we actually entering a new age of cults? Or are we just seeing something that has always existed, only now the technology makes it impossible to hide? I started digging into what psychologists and sociologists are saying about this, and not surprisingly, not everyone is in agreement. Some researchers argue that the underlying psychology hasn't really changed at all. The same human needs that fueled groups like Jonestown or Heaven's Gate still exist today: the desire for belonging, the search for certainty, the hope that someone somewhere has figured out how the world really works. From that perspective, the internet didn't create cult dynamics. It simply accelerated them. The sociologist Zeynep Tufekci has written about how online networks allow movements to, quote, scale without leaders. Instead of physical compounds, communities now organize through platforms, live streams, and group chats. The people who might have been drawn to a high control group in any era can now find one another instantly. But other researchers think something deeper might be happening. Digital platforms reward content that is emotionally intense, morally urgent, and framed as secret knowledge, the kinds of claims that historically have helped high control movements grow. In other words, the architecture of the internet may unintentionally amplify the very kinds of narratives that cult leaders have always relied on. And then there's a third explanation that shows up again and again in the research. Over the past few decades, many of the institutions that once structured everyday life have weakened. Churches, civic groups, neighborhood organizations, even long term workplaces. For a lot of people, the traditional places where belonging used to happen aren't as strong as they once were. When that happens, tightly organized communities that promise meaning, identity, and certainty can become very appealing, even when the beliefs themselves sound improbable. So the debate among researchers isn't really settled. Are we seeing more cults, or are we simply seeing them more clearly because the internet has turned what used to be hidden communities into public ones? When I started researching this two-part series, I knew it was going to lean heavily into psychology. What I didn't expect was just how impossible it is to talk about the evolution of cults without putting psychology and sociology in the front seat. History ends up being more like the view out of the windshield, the mountain range you're driving through. It shows you where you've been and the shape of the terrain, but the forces actually steering the car, those live in human behavior. And the deeper I got into this research, the harder it became to arrive at a clean conclusion. Are we entering a new age of cults because the digital world makes them easier to build? Or are we simply watching the same psychological patterns play out in a new environment where people can find each other faster than ever before? Honestly, I'm still forming my opinion, but I'd love to hear what you all think. Because if there's one thing the story makes clear, It's that technology may change the stage, but the human mind is still writing the script. Thanks for listening to This Again. I'm Mallory Faust, and I'll see you next time.